Yeah, thanks very much, organizer, for inviting me. I feel a little bit tired already, and I beg you patience for another 30 minutes. And you have already heard how cruel the Japanese bureaucracy can be, and I'm also the victim, and at the same time I'm responsible for that. And at the same time, yeah, I should, we have already learned it. So my title here is a kind of tentative overview of Kumaraswamy's work in Japan. I enter directly into my topic. Some, indication that Kumaraswamy had interest in Japanese Buddhist sculptures. Of course, it's not his choice. And yeah, probably, where? This direction or? Yeah. So already mentioned there is a close friendship between Okakura Kakuzo and Rabindranath Tagore. And Tagore made a recollection, I quote, Okakura would often buy some very cheap thing, and it was during his trip in Bengal in 91, 92. Cheap things like simple clay oil pots that peasants use with ecstasy of admiration, something which we had failed to realize, the instinct for beauty. And this may be the starting point for my whole discussion today. And as already mentioned, Sister Nivedita also played a very important role in the relationship of these persons. And Okakura was indebted to her for the editing of his first book, which was published shortly after his stay in India. And he was saying, it is rare that the chivalresque pen of Lafcadio Khan or that of the author of the Web of the Indian Life enlivens the Oriental darkness with the torch of our own sentiment. And as is already mentioned, for them the unity of Asia, unity of India was so important, and the notion of idea was also quite important. And as you see, Havel's title, The Ideas of Indian Art, is a kind of direct repercussion of Okakura's books published 7 years earlier. The ideas was so important for all of them. And it's also the case with Kumaraswamy. And this is a very famous article. But just as through all Indian schools of thought, there runs like a golden thread the fundamental idealism of Upanishad, the Vedanta, and up until his last years, Vedanta was so important. And in final place, he is saying, this unified principle is here also idealism. He is saying idealism, and this must of necessity have been so, for the synthesis of Indian thought is one, not many. This is an ideological statement, but which was necessary. And in response to that kind of, intellectual atmosphere in Bengal, Okakura, he was staying there, was using the term advaitism, for example, which comes from, directly from Vivekananda. They met on December in 91. And he is saying that Japan is also the example of that spirit of living advaitism, which welcomes the new without losing the old. This is his interpretation, which he develops later in the latter part. And he reinterpreted in a rather, according to another sutra in Buddhism sutra. And in the final part, he says, for art, like the diamond net of Indra, reflects the whole chain in every link. So everything is reflecting in one thing, and one thing is reflecting to everything. It is that idea which through which he tried to define the Asia is one. And Sister Nivedita, in her preface, underlined that point. I quote, therefore it is of supreme value to show Asia as Mr. Okakura does, not as the congeries of geographical fragments as we imagined, but as a unified living organism, each dependent on all the others, the whole breathing a single complex life. Breathing may be an important term. Wait, whoops. And yeah, Kumaraswamy, yeah, a little bit later, but saying that unity is so important, and he is talking about it in the Ceylon Indian context. The third line, fourth line, India without Ceylon is incomplete, for in many ways Ceylon is a more perfect window through which to gaze on Indian past. It was his position at that moment. And also Asian thought, and this phrase is during his First World War. Asian thought again affirms the unity and interdependence. Also interdependence is coming of all life at a moment when Europe begins to realize that the fruit of life is not easily attainable in a society based upon division. So instead of division, he is insisting on the importance of unity. And of course, that imagined unity in the Indian subcontinent was counterbalanced to his, this appreciation of the Gandhara sculpture. And on that subject matter, we have already touched, so I skip. But at the end of the First World War, Kumaraswamy still maintained that position as you see here. And back to 1913, Sister Nivedita as untimely death was followed by the publication of this book. And in the preface, as all you know probably, Kumaraswamy was insisting on the importance of the latter part. All those illiterate but wise peasant and women whose knowledge of the Purana has been gained by listening, recitations or reading or visiting temples or from folk songs and mystery plays, which they wanted to collect and put into English and to publish. And as you have already remarked, that Sister Nivedita's last will is faithfully transmitted in these 4 lines. Oops. And probably one of the best summary of this context is given by Topoti. And in Kumaraswamy and in Okakura, Orientalism acquired more decidedly nationalistic overtones, rooting itself in a patriotic fervor of rejuvenated Japan on the one hand, or a deep crisis of self-identity at the denationalization of Ceylon on the other. And Nivedita in between, through her direct participation in the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, could most effectively harness these ideas in the projection of nationalist renaissance of Indian art. And I'm more or less following her statements. And just how the Kumaraswamy's books and knowledge were transmitted to Japan, let me show that the arts and crafts in India and Ceylon in 1913 was translated 3 years later in Japanese with a preface, as you see here, and Kumaraswamy's ideological statement. For example, the art is not for the greatest happiness of the greatest number, so he was anti-democratic. And for the great art results from the impulse to express certain clear intuition of life and death, life in large letters, rather than from the conscious wish to make beautiful picture or songs. Yeah, this is very plain expression, but there is a philosophy in it. And one of the main books we are discussing this morning is also translated into Japanese in 1944, just for your reference. And immediately after Okakura's death, he was closely connected with Tagore families. In Japan, there was a kind of objection to Okakura's authority began to be expressed. Named typically by Professor Taki Seiichi. He is the founding father of the Department of Art History at the Tokyo Imperial University. And he is quoting something quite strange. A Japanese author has come to a strange conclusion that a deeper and more informed study of the work of Gandhara itself will reveal a greater prominence of Chinese than the so-called Greek influence, and so on and so forth. And this is, from our standpoint, anachronical, but it also shows that at the beginning of the 20th century, the chronology of Gandhara sculpture and also its relationship with China was still very unclear. But by 1911, 10 years later, as Vincent Smith was saying, the chronology was already established, and Okakura's pioneering work had lost its credibility. And one of the successor of Okakura, because Takei was editor-in-chief of the very famous periodical Kokka, which was founded by Okakura himself. And although he was successor, he intentionally quoted from Vincent Smith to discredit his predecessor. So there is something very complicated which was happening in Japan. And the same Taki was very critical about the Bengali paintings, which were transmitted, which were exhibited in Japan thanks to Okakura's initiative. But Taki, the professor at Tokyo University, was not really agreeable with that. And instead of that, and he was ambitious enough to send an expedition to Ajanta, saying that the technical similarity of the Japanese alfresco painting from the ancient times have more similarity with the Gandhara technique. So the Japanese Academy has a kind of advantage over the Western scholarship and so on and so forth. You can see here a very clear kind of reversed Orientalism, which was propping among the academicians, the archaeologists and the art historians of that period in Japan. Oops. And actually, Arai Kampo, who was sent to Ajanta, made a very close copy, which is more faithful than the pictures which was taken at that period of some of the most important relics. And also, there are 3 Japanese artists who are involved with that. And unfortunately, most of these copies were lost because of the Kanto Great Earthquake, which happened in 1923. And now I'm coming to my second topic. And the previous chapter was already more or less known to you. But from this on, I think most of the elements will be quite new for you. I want to make a kind of comparison between this aesthetician, Yanagi Muneyoshi, with Kumaraswamy's case. And maybe it's better that yeah, as Mustafa had already mentioned, Okakura once tried to make an appointment with Kumaraswamy when they were in London, but we are not quite sure if they really could make it. On the contrary, Yanagi could meet Kumaraswamy once in 1920 when Kumaraswamy came to Tokyo, but I am not quite sure if their encounter was really fruitful because there is no trace which left later from neither of them. And anyway, Yanagi Muneyoshi was a person who was quite interested in the Korean arts and crafts, and he regretted the loss of Korean cultural heritage after Japanese so-called annexation, which happened in 1910, following the Japan's victory in Russo-Japan War in 1995. And the most famous case is the most famous one is the case of Kamamun, and which was decided to be demolished by the Japanese government. And Yanagi lamented that loss and saying, and he is telling to the gate as if it is a person, it were a person, your fate is coming to an end, and yet those who wish to save your life from this are sentenced to treason. And this text in showing his friendship with Korean people and his familiarity with Korean culture was heavily censored if you see the published text during that time. But at the same time, some of them are directly translated into English at that period. So Yanagi was under police, he was the object of espionage by the regime and so forth. And in that context, Yanagi was saying, not to the Koreans, but to the Japanese compatriot, for example, our Japanese comrade listened. All day that takes the sword shall perish with a sword. And this is a very famous biblical expression that he is using to warn the Japanese. And it has some very interesting consonance with what Kumaraswamy was saying, more or less in the same context on the same period. There is a serious danger that the degradation of Asia will ultimately menace the security of European social idealism. And that would be a strange nemesis if European post-industrialists should ultimately be defeated by an industrialism of imperialism of Europe, origin established in the East. In the near future, the Japanese empire would incarnate that industrial and imperialism Europe. So you see clearly that Japan's position as an empire was quite ambiguous because it's at the same time one of the Asian nations, but still it wanted to be qualified as one of the superpowers of that period. And Yanagi did know that dilemma. And the same kind of observation is frequently seen in Kumaraswamy's writing during the World War I and shortly after that. The iron hand crushed the tyrant's head and became the tyrant in his stead. Who can say the source original? I can probably ask that question to my students in my university classes. And battles are lost in the same spirit in which they are won, which is from Walter Whitman, which was also quoted by Kumaraswamy. And Yanagi also saying something quite similar. As you see, if you respect your own freedom, why not respect the freedom of the other? If we violate this obvious human ethics, the world shall be your enemy. If so, it shall not be Korea but Japan that perishes, and so on and so forth. So you can see a kind of colonial situation which covers all over the world, and what is uttered in Indian subcontinent is more or less repeated also in Japan in reference to Korea, which was colonized by Japan. So Kumaraswamy is saying this, India affords the most tragic spectacle and so forth. And Yanagi would say, instead of India, Korea affords the most tragic spectacle of the world and so forth. And finally, the greatest danger for India, maybe the greatest danger for Korea, is the loss of her spiritual integrity. And Yanagi himself made that kind of experience when he visited one of the art schools in Korea, where the Japanese teachers are forcing the Korean girl student to make the embroideries with Western styles, and Yanagi find it simply foolish. Foolish is the term he's using, and he was criticizing the Japanese way of mimicking the Western colonialism in culture politics. And both of them would agree by saying, in the final line, we shall accomplish nothing by pressing anything in mold. These phrases is also, you can find repeated in Yanagi's message. And we have already talked about the medievalism and the idealization of the caste system or the guild system. So I don't repeat the same, but some of the passages on Kumaraswamy at the end of the World War I is more or less echoing in Yanagi, although Yanagi is not directly referring to Kumaraswamy. It's before their encounter in Tokyo. But as you know, Yanagi is going to make the manifest of his popular craft, and the popular craft is the common translation, but the term for popular will be, in our context, ethnic. Ethnic craftsman would be more or less relevant in original Chinese character. Anyway, he published that manifest, which is translated by and adapted by Bernard Leach, and you can have the access to these texts by the unknown craftsman. And I strongly recommend you to, especially for young students, to read it and make the comparison with the case of Kumaraswamy. So I leave this work to the next generation, and I skip that detail for today's presentation. Anyway, as you see, the criticism, capitalism, industrialization are common in both of these thinkers. And the most interesting thing is in relation with Nietzsche's reinterpretation of Nietzsche, which was proposed by Kumaraswamy. In the final part of that manifesto of the popular crafts, Yanagi was saying, it was in 1928, even a good man attains salvation, then why not a bad man? This is a quote from a very famous Japanese Buddhist monk, Shinran, of the 12th century. And Yanagi quoted intentionally that phrase at the end of his manifest. And what is saying is similar to the idea that Kumaraswamy tried to develop. Do what you will, and as Nietzsche said, is neither egotistic nor altruistic. Truth and ideal selfishness consist in always watching over and restraining the soul, so that our productiveness may come to a beautiful termination, and so on and so forth. These ideas are projected on the idealized craftsmanship in both of these thinkers. So, for example, as you know, Kumaraswamy is also saying, and far from a doctrine of self-indulgence, Nietzsche's ideal selfishness is a form of asceticism or ardor. So in reality, the selfishness is rather the lack of selfishness. So there is a kind of contradiction in it. And he is saying also that the activity of genius is not an obedience to rules, but dedication of life to what is commanded from within, even though it should appear to all others as evil. And I don't have the quotation here, but Yanagi is saying that craftsmanship is beyond good and evil, and because he is concentrating on his own work with the lack of deprived of selfishness, and his work is located beyond good and evil. And you can see quite easily their similarity with the essential part of Nietzsche's thought. And the following thing is also quite relevant. The highest attainment of purpose of humanity is the most difficult thing for self-assertive minds to grasp. So self-assertiveness must be abandoned so as to attain the ideal. And Yanagi himself is trying to develop that idea in his explanation of the unknown craftsman who concentrate in his or her work by not trying to become famous, but really making a kind of devotion in his or her own work. So I continue the quote, the way of ego assertion cannot be a royal road to realization of the self. The self here is redefined, as you can see. And all that is best for us comes of itself into our hand, but if we strive to overtake it, it perpetually eludes us. And I think this is quite relevant. So now coming to my last part. May I have some time? Yes? Yes? 1 minute? Yeah. The metaphor of Shiva becomes quite important. And as all of you says, Kumaraswamy was saying that Shiva is the destroyer and lovers of burning grounds. And make room for your soul and for other souls, destroy, because all creation proceeds from destruction, and so on and so forth. And he is talking of the, but the shape must be perpetually destroyed, break every cup from which you drink. And in my presentation today, I began with a quote from Okakura's book on the Book of Tea, where he make a poem saying that the cup of humanity is concentrated in a cup of tea. Humanity equal tea. And in appearance, that position by Okakura is clear antagonism, the opposite of what Kumaraswamy is saying, that the cup must be broken. And Kumaraswamy is also quoting another proverb, Indian proverb, as all earthen vessels made by the potters break at last, so is the life of man. So on the one side, Indian side, destruction. On the other side, humanity is contained in a cup. How can we come to a kind of compromise or synthesis of these two apparently opposite opinions? With this, I want to conclude my paper. And for your reminder, Okakura was famously saying, the usefulness of the water pitcher dwelt in the emptiness where water might be put, not in the form of the pitcher or the material of which it was made, and so on and so forth. And he insists on the importance of vacuum, and this is a very famous passage from Okakura's. And the bridge between these two oppositions may be filled by one Japanese who initiated Yanagi to Korean ceramics, but he was also a very good friend of a certain Mr. Shin. And there is a photo that Japanese Asagawa sent to a certain Mr. Shin. And that Mr. Shin is recently, 5 years ago, I think, finally identified as Gurcharan Shin. Who knows Gurcharan Shin in this? Nobody heard of it? Yeah. You can see. Yeah. That's right. And the Indian side couldn't identify that Japanese with eyeglasses, and the Korean side could not identify this Indian chic person. And it's finally 5 years ago that we could make these two identification, and it was in Korean Press Club that I had a chance to make a lecture on that. As you see, it was Gurcharan Shin who was befriended Asagawa Takumi, and Asagawa Takumi is literally the best person, initiator and connoisseur of the Korean ceramics. And the piece which is in center in between them is even nowadays treasured at the Osaka porcelain ceramic museums, and which was exhibited so frequently by the Association of Japanese folk crafts, as you see on the right side. And please look at the lotus flower, which is in the center. What was the implication? What was the symbolism? With that, I'm going to conclude. And James Cousins, a very famous writer and a poet, and Vishwanathan in Columbia University is making a study on her. And he left a very interesting poem, which is on your left lines, to an artist in clay. And let me make a paraphrase from that. In a poem which Cousins published in Japan Advertiser newspaper in 1920, he praised Potter. He opened that God creates human beings from clay, and creatures return to soil after death. the potter unconsciously repeats the same process of that transmigration. Thus a potter's work is the most sublime. Usually potters are not so highly appreciated in the social category hierarchy, but Cousins is trying to make a kind of upside down here. And the circle of shaping and destroying also reminds us Genesis in the Old Testament. And the soil, containing the soul and also container of the soul, also transmigrates by itself. Thus, Christianity on the one hand and Buddhism on the other collaborate to praise the divine creation. That's the message that Cousins are trying to transmit. And this poem was actually dedicated to no other than to Gurcharan Shin. And as you see here, he, later years returning to India, became one of the founder of the study of potter, more or less in the lineage of the tradition of Bernard Leach. Yeah, there are many discussions on that. But anyway, you can see that the Korean inspiration was transmitted by Gurcharan Singh and back to India. And as you see here, the same pot, which was so important, and Gurcharan Singh, together with his Japanese and Korean colleagues when he was in Korea. And one of the examples that Cousins highly appraised of pieces Gurcharan Singh created during his stay in Japan in 1920. And he was also under police and control, and his whereabouts and identification, the behavior was, closely covered by the police. But still, Gurcharan Singh enjoyed friendship while he was in Japan. On the left, he was working with the potter's school in Seto. And on the right side, there is strange gathering of garakta, kai garakta, that means bric-a-brac, and they are with strange attire. And on the center, you can see Gurcharan Singh. So, and among them, the first person dressed in white is Antonin Raymond, the famous architect coming from Czech. So they are working together. And before finishing, I made a discovery of this passage only 3 days before coming here. And a Japanese scholar by the name of Okada is made a book on Indian art. And in that he frequently quotes from Kumaraswamy and saying this. And for example, he quoted this passage: "The silent sages destroying the threefold bond are established where their selves are destroyed." So the self must be destroyed to establish the true, to become a real sage who is, and there they behold the sacred and filled with bliss and so forth. And the place where the ego is destroyed signifies the state where illusions and deeds are burnt away. This is the crematorium, the burning ground where Sri Nataraja dances. This is a famous phrase in his article on the dance of Shiva. And he is also saying, our Lord is the dance who, like the heart latent in firewood, diffuses his power in mind and matter and makes them dance in their turn, and so on and so forth. And he is quoting from Meister Eckhart, and Eckhart was very important not only in India but also in Japan at the period. And just as the fire infuses the essence and cleanness into the dry wood, so has God done with man, and so on and so forth. So by these phrases, Okakura identified the dance of Shiva as an expression of Kumaraswamy's Nietzsche understanding. And in fact, Nietzsche's idealism, opening up a world beyond pessimism and optimism, here is the key, the joy of the material which transforms itself through destruction into eternity, is the observation that Japanese scholar made on that subject matter. So I'm finishing. So for example, last example, Kumaraswamy is saying in Dance of Shiva, phase alternation implied by the drum and the fire, which changes, not destroys. And this phrase is paraphrased by the Japanese scholar in the following way. The dance of Nataraja by Shiva signifies a space which vibrates according to the alternation of drum. His fire does not really annihilate everything, but shows the phase of flux, fluidity, and self-force. And the rhythm he tread ignites inner soul and immortal torch, which is also from Okamoto. And to this, probably we can make connection with what Yanagi is talking of the Korean ceramic. That is Korean white slipwares are the spontaneous pulsation of life. Pulsation is a term which reappears quite often, recording the natural rhythm of the wind that blows, the streams that flow, and the clouds that rise into the air. They could be called a direct manifestation of the natural life lived by those who made a pot of the placid frame of mind in which they rose and lay down in harmony with nature. So you can see the closeness between Yanagi's reflection on the craftsmanship in Korea and Kumaraswamy's idea of the dance of Shiva. So with that, probably I can finish. The lotus motif, which was so important, was repeated by Gurcharan Singh in his creation, returning to India. And it was a kind of refutation to Sir Birdwood. His name was mentioned several times, and he was trying to explain the palmette coming from Greece, so the Indian art is made under the influence of Greece and so forth. But Gurcharan Singh tried to make the refutation by showing that nowadays the lotus motif, which is so important in Buddhism, and Kumaraswamy was writing many things in the 30s on that water iconography. And that lotus flower is of Korean inspiration, is now coming back to India through the creation of Gurcharan Singh. So probably I can skip, but as you know, the Ajanta caves mural paintings was transmitted all the way to Horyoji Kondo Temple with these, similar divinities, representations, and it happened in the ancient times, and now in 1920s, the return is becoming is accomplished by through Gurcharan Singh's inspiration, Korean inspiration, coming back to India. So with this I can finish, and I think I could make a bridge between Kumaraswamy's thought and Yanagi's thought in medievalism and in the idealization of the craftsmanship, and which was bridged by by Indian potter, but he was also closely related with the Japanese who really loved Korea. So thanks very much for your attention.